So we've talked about the dominant INFP. We've talked about the creative INFP. Let's talk about, it's a hard word for me. It makes me feel a little icky inside. Normalizing INFP. Not if you identify with this, you don't make me feel icky as an INFP.
Definitely not.
But the idea that anything could be normalized or normal, like just the word creeps me out. I don't know why.
Yeah.
But there are, even of my personality type, people that identify a lot with this subtype. And so what does the INFP normalizing subtype look like?
Yeah, well, it's unsurprising that you don't like it because I think you have creative subtype preferences.
Oh, there you go.
And the creative and the normalizing are exact opposites, right? They don't often play well with each other, but they actually really benefit from being in each other's energy. Unsurprising. So this is a more conventional and specialized style of INFP. And this is, they function a little bit better in mainstream society. They don't have that challenge that the creative INFP subtype does, where it's like hard to, buckle down and do all that stuff that society requires of us.
Yeah.
But this type works hard. They're extremely loyal to loved ones and friends. They do their best to be beacons of calm, right? They're like a more chill INFP, a more chill INFP that just does what needs to be done, right? As opposed to the INFP, the creative subtype that might even believe they have ENFP preferences. They might even mistake themselves for extroverts. This INFP might mistake themselves for having sensory preferences or perhaps also being a judger, but they'll know that they're an introvert. The normalizing style tends to rely more on patience and hard work than creative ideas to get through things. They also excel at speaking and listening. All INFPs really have this capacity for communication, particularly listening.
Listening to other people's stories, like deep listening to a story of another human being.
Right. This INFP actually, even though all INFPs are good at what you just mentioned, listening to a story, there is also a lot of capacity for language-based reasoning and linear deduction and abstract concepts. So it might almost be a little bit more of a thinker style of INFP as well. They might mistake themselves for having thinking preferences. This might be an INFP that thinks they are an INTP as well, because they have that capacity to listen and plug it into those abstractions a little bit more. They're less thinking about it just on the terms of what it says about who they are as a person and more trying to figure it out. And so this INFP might actually come across, like I said, almost like having thinker preferences. So
what I imagine is happening there is language is like compressed thought, right? A word means so much. And clearly an INFP is going to resonate with the emotions that they feel, like the deep emotions that come up that usually are non-lingual or post-lingual. Like you can't really describe the complexity of introverted feeling or authenticity emotions. But if you're focused on language models and the way we use language, you're going to be a little bit more of a digital thinker. It's not as analog in your heart and your guts. It's more up in your head and the logic and the literal lines of script with the language we're using. So I'd imagine this does lend itself to somebody who, like you might find this type of INFP, I'm guessing, as we go through the job list, like in the lab doing like research.
Yep.
Or being able to, probably a host of things around language, English majors, teaching, like all sorts of stuff like this, right?
Yep.
Let's go down into some of the jobs they would have.
Well, I was going to say that they have enough of a capacity for contemplation that it stands out.
Yeah.
So facts, figures, symbols, metaphors, memories, stories, they ruminate on all of those long and deep. And so that's like a thoughtful version, not just like an introspective version, but like one that really contemplates on things like numbers. So like you said, that they might be more attracted to the sciences. They might be more attracted to, things that are more technical in nature. Again, this is the opposite of the creative INFP. The creative INFP is leaning real hard on their imagination, leaning really hard on being able to come up with new things. This INFP is a little bit more leaning on rumination and really being able to be thoughtful. So You might find them in pretty much any traditional career, even really technical ones, particularly large institutions. They tend to find themselves in bigger companies, organizations, and institutions. And some of the kinds of roles they tend to take on is, unsurprisingly, teacher, but also researcher, right? Like you mentioned. And this could be anything like a social researcher, market research, user experience research, right? Because they're still interested in the human experience, but the human experience as it pertains to how it related to whatever they just, what this product is, right? Nonprofit worker is one that's very common for INFPs no matter what, but things like quality assurance engineer, that could also be in the wheelhouse of this kind of INFP. Technical writing. Writing is always a strength for INFP types, but this could be more of a technical style as opposed to, say, journalism or creative writing. This could be about really putting onto the page how a person needs to understand something in order to be able to engage with it.
Yeah.
And any form of documentation. But they could also be like a policy analyst or, a lab researcher. There's a lot of things that can fit this INFP label.
Okay. So if you're identifying with this INFP, this subtype of normalizing, I think one thing to be mindful of is, well, two things. One is you're probably the subtype that's going to have the most challenge getting out of your rut and getting out there into the world to do something new, to open up some new energy. Like, you're going to want to stay in your comfort zone. It's just, of the subtypes, you're going to want to do that. It's also important for this subtype, though, that you might have a traditional job or that lab job. Maybe it's not a traditional job, but it's a job that you have to show up to or something you got to people are relying on you. Things are relying on you. You're probably highly specialized. We've found that all types that identify with this normalizing really do need an outlet outside of their workplace. And I don't think INFPs are any different. They need something to keep that energy of extroverted intuition, exploration, that co-pilot auxiliary function. Keep it humming, even if it's just a hobby, just something outside of your normal day-to-day. Otherwise, you're going to start to see the light in you go out over time. And so that's something I think this type has to be just like the creatives had to be mindful of the platform or something. This type has to be mindful that they don't get themselves too static, too stuck in a rut.
Well, there's actually 3 different disadvantages to being the style of INFP.
Wow. Not just 2, there's 3.
Well, I guess
Let me come in again.
I guess you could say that one of them might not be a disadvantage for the INFP themselves, but this could be the more stubborn of the subtypes. They tend to be the most stubborn.
What?
Yeah. And so, like you said, that's a little bit associated with the rut piece.
Yeah.
That's what comes along with being, somebody who's thinking deeply, is that you kind of get attached to the things that you've been thoughtful and contemplative of. Yeah. But they're also simultaneously very tolerant. So it's a tolerant subtype that when you hit the thing you hit, they're pretty stubborn. So that's the first thing. The second is that they tend to downplay themselves for the greater good, or maybe even sacrifice themselves for the greater good. And so they might do a job for a long time and be overlooked or not have people really understand their contribution. And so one of the disadvantages is that they really need to kind of speak up for themselves.
So this is that keeping that extrovert intuition. You're in a meeting and you have a great idea and people don't hear it, they overlook it or they dismiss it. That energy, bringing more of that energy forward of assertion is going to help you be heard.
Yeah, exactly. So that's
the subtype has to do that.
Yeah. And so they might want to lean in a little bit on the dominant INFP for that, to make sure that they're not being overlooked and they're not being passed over, especially when they've worked hard to get it. And finally, the third disadvantage is that they tend to be the clumsiest of all the INFPs. In brain scans, it appears as if they have some of the worst visual spatial capacity. So they might want to shy away from anything where they have to do dangerous physical activities.
Like driving?
Yeah, maybe. Right. Something
I was kidding, but you're serious.
Yeah. Like if they are a long haul truck driver, that might be something that's not the best choice of job, or anything that requires like physical danger, or puts themselves in a position where physically, like, visual spatial capacities are very important. So that's one of the disadvantages as well.
Gotcha. All right, so let's talk a little deeper level here. Neurotransmitter, serotonin. This is going to be the drug of choice.
Yeah, drug of choice.
And then how the attunements of the 2 cognitive functions. So introverted feeling, authenticity, driver, dominance, and co-pilot of extroverted intuition or exploration, auxiliary. What's the attunement of these two functions?
So it's the opposite of the creative. So in this case, it would be the judging function, introverted feeling, like you mentioned. The judging function is the analytic function, and the perceiving function of extroverted intuition is the holistic. So there's a lot more certainty around the, that crusade concept is a little more familiar to them, like believing things are really important and having that drive. But the intuitive aspect, sort of the part that comes up with the imaginative ideas and gets really creative, that part's a little bit more open, right? It's not as it doesn't have as certain of a they're not leaning on as much certainty as the INFP is with their creativity.
Well, that would also speak maybe to that characteristic of, stubbornness is the word you used, but resistance to quick changes. Like if my introverted feeling as an INFP, if your introverted feeling or authenticity is focused and it doesn't want to make compromises, well, it's not going to want to make compromises. You want to stay on course,
Right.
what you want to do in the world. And so you're going to be less likely to go, oh yeah, let's work together on this. No, you have a vision of what you think is the right way to go. Your should statements are very definitive.
Whereas if it's not anything that triggers any of that, then you're pretty open.
Yeah.
You're open to whatever's going on. So it's also, that's where you get that tolerance and at the same time, the stubbornness.